Good morning, Howie. How are you?
I'm great, Jamie. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. And it's brilliant to turn the tables because I had the honor of being interviewed by you for your own Plant Yourself podcast recently. So it's great to switch things around. Yeah.
Yeah, especially since we sort of ran out of time before we got into the tough stuff.
Yeah, we only covered the basics and the easy pieces. So we'll see how we get on today. Yeah. And we were put in touch by our mutual friend, Mike Kaplan, who, the New York based comedian who I had the pleasure of having as a guest here a few episodes ago. It's like drinking from a fire hose. So yeah, it was great that he put us in touch, and it's been great to get to know you a little.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm so tickled to have friends like you and Mike in my life. Like, I just think about it and I go, I must be pretty awesome myself. Like,
I think so. Likewise. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And we talked a little bit before that this series is trying to answer two crazily basic, but I think deeply important questions: what's real, and what and who matters. So I have a clear bias because I'm framing these conversations in the context of sentientism, a really simple pluralistic worldview I'm trying to develop and build community around, that says when it comes to thinking about what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to thinking about what and who matters, the critical thing, the clue is in the name, is sentience, the capacity to have experiences, to suffer, to flourish. But I'm having conversations, as you know, with people who agree and disagree with both or either of those aspects of the philosophy. So it'd be fascinating to understand your own journey and where you've got to now on those two crazily big questions. But before we get into them, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
First thing I would say is I don't actually know the answer to either of those questions yet.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to finding out what I think.
Sounds good. Sounds good. We could go on the journey together. Yeah.
Yeah. Howie Jacobson. So I'm a coach, an author. I have sort of two dual career tracks. At the moment, I work with executives and organizations, around productivity and leadership and values. And one of the reasons I do that is a kind of a pragmatism, because I can be a very purist kind of guy. Like,
Yeah.
I want to be very untainted, and I'm not a big fan of capitalism. So,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if my clients should be listening to this, but there's a way in which I just want to wash my hands of all that, and at the same time being part of the conversations around sort of intelligent altruism or effective altruism. Like, the organizational world is where things are going to happen or not.
Yeah.
And we can talk about, like, he said, you promised we could talk about like how to make the world better, and how I see that work as part of that in sort of empowering people to become psychologically flexible to, one of the big parts of my work is to help people respond to reality.
Yeah.
Like, so much of, and the other half is I do work with people around health. I co-founded a health startup based on changing health behaviors, lifestyle, diet, stress, meditation, things like that. And in both cases, when people are self-sabotaging or they're not being their best selves, it's because they are responding to an environment that does not exist.
Yeah.
Whether it's a past environment or a fear environment created by their neuroception of threat. And so when we talk about what's real, like, I don't know actually what's real, but we can see clearly where there are mismatches between our behavior and the environment that we're within.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would say that's the basis of my work, is helping people recognize reality and respond flexibly to it to achieve their goals.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And yeah, we'll return to many of those themes as we go through. But the first of these two crazy questions, and I think your answer that you don't really know the answer is probably the best one, is what's real. So for many of my guests, that's a story about, I guess, a philosophical journey they've been on that so far is always incomplete. I think it should be incomplete, but tends to be about whether they grew up originally in maybe a supernatural or a religious or a spiritual sort of family context and social context, or one that was more naturalistic, atheistic, agnostic, maybe scientifically minded, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like. But yeah, it'd be fascinating to know your personal story and where you are now.
Yeah. So I grew up in New Jersey in a conservative Jewish household.
Yeah.
Which, for people who don't know, kind of means atheist.
Yeah. An interesting way of putting it.
Right. So like we were very culturally Jewish. My mother was a child of the Holocaust. She, was sent away at the age of 14 from her home in Vienna to be one of the child leaders of the kindertransport, which was a group of, hundreds and hundreds of children who ended up in England. Yeah. And on the train, there were no adults with them. It was, she was 14. There were kids as young as 2 or 3. And so, I would say her religion was the Jews must survive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Basically F Hitler. Right. So that, it wasn't, and so any sort of religiosity and my dad grew up very culturally Jewish. His whole family were actors and producers and directors and composers in the Yiddish theater.
Oh yeah.
Which so he kind of grew up in this very secular but very Jewish environment. I have stories about my grandfather playing pinochle with Leon Trotsky in the before the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
So I would say his credo was Jewish identity and socialism.
Yeah.
And so I grew up, we would go to synagogue, we would talk to but it was all like, okay, this is a cultural ethic and it's a morality issue. Like, the Jews are like, we have to be better than everybody else. We're the light unto the nation. And yet, but it was all based on sort of reason and natural law. I remember when I was maybe 9 or 10, my dad gave me this book called The Truth About the Bible. I can't remember much, but like the first line was like, anything that shocks the mind of a child cannot be the true religion. And it was a very sort of heavy-handed attack on like these stories in the Bible that kids don't know about, like all the, incest and rapes and stuff like that. But also like pointing out all the logical inconsistencies.
That's quite a gift at 9 years old.
Yeah, it was, it was a terrible book, right? Like, it was completely tendentious and there was no compassion to it.
Just a blunt attack. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was very heady. Like, and
how did you respond to that? Up to that point, do you think you'd by default sort of bought into the supernatural aspects as well?
No.
Not really. You just sort of, Again, it was a cultural thing and a group thing.
Yeah. So my dad would he was very good friends with this Orthodox rabbi, and he would always be needling the guy, and he'd tell me the stories like, oh, it's Saturday, it's the Sabbath, you have to rest today, so now you got to walk up 30 flights of stairs. Like, okay, tell me how that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So he would go to synagogue, and he always had a book that was slightly smaller than the prayer book, so he could hide it.
Tuck it inside, yeah.
Right. So I grew up very, very Jewish, and what I got from it was we completely undogmatic. The scriptures that I read were all Talmudic, which was basically a bunch of guys arguing.
Yeah. And that seems to be quite central to many, certainly many parts of the Jewish culture and faith, is that constant questioning and challenge. And
and so what I learned was, well, the Jews have learned to argue and to doubt and to question. So our heroes were Einstein, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, like people who came from the Jewish core and brought that core to the periphery and argued about things.
Yeah.
So like I was very proud of that, growing like we're and frankly, like I don't like talking about God would have been a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah.
Like, you're some kind of rube.
Yeah.
So I would say, but it wasn't exactly naturalistic either, because we had our stories, right? Our religion was the Jewish people have to survive.
Yeah.
And, we see that religion today, and there's a whole, there's a lot of controversy around, at what cost? Like the state of Israel is built around, we have to survive at all costs. Right. And that's, I don't have to tell you and your viewers that there's problems.
Yeah.
Right. And, but once it's the religion, then it becomes, everything else becomes falsifiable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So along with that was a very, very strong dose of militant Zionism.
Yeah.
Right. And when I was 14, I remember writing these essays for the synagogue newspaper about this rabbi who came and spoke, who was highly critical of the Israeli government. And I tore into him.
Yeah.
From my 14-year-old perspective. So it wasn't like I was a free thinker.
Yeah.
It was just I had different religions.
Yeah.
And they weren't.
And that's fascinating, because, and I think there's a couple of things that I picked up there. One is, I think it's true of almost any religious community that there are many more atheists and agnostics within it than you would realize. Sometimes just because they don't speak out, sometimes because, it's a risky thing to do. But it does seem to me, from the stats I've seen and from talking to people, that within the Jewish community, it seems to be, really, really common. A lot of people in the Jewish community, there's a cultural thing, there's a group thing. They'll enjoy the rituals and participate, but the supernatural belief, just isn't there. So that was one angle. But the other thing that I think is important is, often when people think about naturalism or supernaturalism, you zero in on religious views and, for example, atheism versus theism and it is a central question, right? It's a sort of obvious thing to go for, but that's not the only way to have views that are disconnected from reality. There are many other ways of having views that aren't well founded in reality, that have nothing to do with gods or spirits. So so it's interesting how you sort of drew that link. The supernatural wasn't there, but you could still feel elements of the cultural norms and the group identification that had really powerful good effects. But there's always also some difficulties that can flow from those too, almost regardless of the supernatural views. Yeah.
Right. But then, the other thing I noticed, looking back later, was that there was no risk.
Yeah.
To be like, you go to synagogue, and I had a good voice. I was kind of groomed to be a cantor, which I did for many years, amateur. I never went to, rabbinical or cantorial school or anything. But doing that, I would lead high holiday services at the university where I went, and the rabbi and I would sit down and we would plan out every page turn, like who pauses when do we switch to English, when do people stand up, when is it? And so it was a very, very, like, it was safe. Like, there was nothing, like, when I think about like effective ritual, there's like danger to it. There's like, and I'd learned that later when I started doing sweat lodge, that now you're supposed to, like, you're under this incredible pressure. You're supposed to sort of speak what comes to you in the moment. And then later on, I was teaching at a Quaker school where, you sit quietly and the inner voice prompts you to speak and you don't censor.
Yeah.
Right. And stuff just happens and comes out. And I realized, like, that was all missing. It was a very sanitized, safe, conventional, suburban religion. It was really
programmatic about, and a structure you could fit into. Yeah.
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 So I would say that the next thing that happened to me is I went to college, and it was an Ivy League school where I think everybody's I think everybody's smarter than me when I get there. Like, I'm I'm intimidated, and I'm having a conversation one night at the dining hall with this guy. He's a grad student, incredibly brilliant. I think he was into math or computer science, and he was talking about ghosts. And I thought he was joking. And he wasn't. And like at first I was just arguing, like, how can you be so gullible? And then it occurred to me that, like, oh, there's smart people who believe this.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm missing something. Like, gee, I don't know. Like, there's, like, it kind of threw me, and it was kind of exciting.
Yeah.
Like the idea that my rationalism was not, or my non-spirituality was itself a religion that I had never questioned.
Yeah.
So to be able to talk to someone who could talk about ghosts and his own experiences with ghosts. And then I found a guy who had done a lot of work with parapsychology. And I discovered this whole field of parapsychology, which I discovered was based in like neuroscience and computer and engineering. Like there were people who were doing, these cards, getting people, and, and I did some work at the Pear Lab at Princeton University, which was all like in the basement, and it was set up to kind of assess, is there consciousness between humans and machines? And with the technology, the random event generation, they could run zillions of trials as opposed to just somebody rolling dice or guessing cards.
Yeah.
And I started seeing like there are serious academics who are questioning what was my worldview, which was entirely materialistic, and people writing about quantum physics in ways, and then I'm discovering like Einstein-Bell-Podolsky equations and two particles, spooky action at a distance. And it really kind of opened me up. And of course, I was never a physicist. I was never smart enough to understand any of this at the level where I could, make sense of the arguments or evaluate them.
Yeah.
But what it gave me was this great sense, which I think I hold to this day, like there is a big effing mystery out there.
Yeah.
And
maybe it's not quite as simple as I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's way bigger than I thought. And so like anything that looks like religion to me has two characteristics. One is it's exclusive in that it's, some group is better than some other group or privileged. And like that I completely reject. And the other is, it's got to have like a neat human story attached to it. Like, oh, so whatever this thing is, it's a guy with a beard, or it's got emotions, or like whenever, like anything like reductive.
Yeah, a really like, simple story that plays through it, maybe, or a rationale.
Like something that that's sort of cut down to human size.
Yeah.
Like I reject that, but I very much feel that there's mystery.
Yeah.
And for me, that feeling of mystery, which goes beyond, which includes evidence and reason, but goes beyond it.
Yeah.
Because I don't worship my own reasoning ability, and I don't worship the human ability to take in evidence. Yeah. So like,
it's pretty obviously imperfect, right? So yeah. No, I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. So I see, like, I believe that there is mystery out there.
Yeah.
So I couldn't say if it's ghosts. My wife is, I would say, a very spiritual person, and she has done a lot of work around shamanic practices.
Yeah.
And so I, went to a couple of those, and one of the workshops I went by myself without her, so I wouldn't, embarrass her by being like my usual sort of skeptical, curmudgeonly self. And I wanted to be very honest. There was like 10 of us, and there was this, lovely teacher, and people are going around introducing themselves. And I introduced myself, and I said, like, I'm really interested in this stuff. And I got to say, like, part of me comes here thinking that it's bullshit.
Yeah.
And the teacher looked at me and she smiled and she said, "Oh, honey, it's all bullshit."
That's a great response.
And it shocked me, and it really opened me up. And what she says, like you think about what we know about like perception, like vision. Like we know we're not seeing what really is. There's wavelengths, and our minds are making sense of it. So if you believe that there are like, spirit animals and that are sort of part of your energetic makeup, that's no different than thinking that energy that I'm looking at over there is a tree. Like don't believe one and not the other. Like be open to the fact that like, everything is just this weird soup that we're just trying to make sense of.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. Like, I've experienced coincidences. I've experienced things that look like premonitory dreams that were highly predictive of things that happened.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I've experienced all that. And so I'm like, I have no idea, but it sure is interesting.
Yeah. And I think we touched on this when we had the tables turned. And I think we probably differ a little bit in this space, in that I'm probably a bit more of a sort of boring classical naturalist. So my skepticism around some of that stuff is probably just of a different degree of yours. But I think there's quite a lot of overlap between the way we think about things at the same time, because I'd say that central idea about, having a humility about our own ability to understand reality is important. We're just, in my mind, evolved apes. So, while we should have some sort of perfect ability to completely understand the reality we're part of, I'm not sure where that would even be feasible, right? We've got limited tools, limited perceptions, faulty reasoning. So I think it's entirely fair to be skeptical of even our own ability to understand stuff. And I like the open-mindedness, because, again, without open-mindedness, you become dogmatic. Whatever your current beliefs are based on, you should always be open-minded. And I think the areas where it can get, where I guess I'd like to put a bit of a check in, is it's important to be open-minded, but that means being open-minded to evidence that goes against the things you want to believe as well. We can't just be open-minded in the direction we want to believe. And that often is, a problem. People will go down a one track and say, you need to be open-minded to believe this, but I won't be open-minded about the things that have debunked the thing I want to believe in. So the open-mindedness has to go in, all directions and be unbiased, which is hard. And I think there's also a degree to which being open-minded is compatible with holding back credence or belief until evidence is there. Whereas some people will say, well, like, I'm open-minded, and now even without evidence, I will jump to deciding X, Y, and Z is true. And I'm like, well, I'm open-minded too, but so far the evidence isn't convincing enough for me to believe those things. So I think withholding belief and just saying I don't know is important. And I think the final thing I'd say is just for us to watch out where belief systems leak into causing or justifying harm to others. So I think there are some, belief systems that some people might call supernatural or spiritual or mystical that are, just interesting or beneficial to the individuals involved. And then there are some others where it can leak into systems of thought that can justify causing harm to others. So I think those are some of the sort of checks I like to place around these things. But at the core, I totally agree with that humility and that open-mindedness. And I'd also say that when I talk about naturalism, I try and talk about it in quite a broad sense. So it's not just, I've done a randomized controlled trial and I've had 15 people in lab coats poring over the data, and here is the answer in a peer-reviewed journal. Evidence can include our personal experiences. So your experiences of coincidences, my experience of seeing this coffee mug in front of me. I think personal experience is a type of evidence too. I mean, we should be skeptical of it, of course, as with all evidence, but that's real evidence too, right? And so going down this narrow track of a sort of super scientistic approach that can become its own dogma, here is the answer, here's the evidence, conversation's over, can be just as damaging as a supernatural dogma. So I think we probably differ in emphasis, but there's quite a lot of overlap in that humility and open-mindendness, some sort of a naturalistic approach.
Well, the other thing I discovered, I learned a word recently that was like, oh, that's me. The word is a contextualist.
Yeah.
So what for me that means, like, how's this working for me? So very like I'll give you an example from the work I do. I teach people who are in like almost all of the work that people do around, well, either with themselves or with others is like there's conflict. Like I want the chocolate and I don't want to have the chocolate, or you're writing me about something and we're not communicating well. And what I teach people is to look for and assume positive intent.
Yeah.
Right. So in the other person, like, so they're criticizing me or they're interrupting people in meetings. Like, so what's the positive intent? What are they trying to achieve? They're trying to maintain a certain level of quality. They're trying to get their ideas out there. They're trying to belong. Like, whatever we're doing, there's some goal that we have, even if it's unexplored, and even if we're, shooting ourselves in the foot around it.
So you're trying to get into their head and also be charitable in assuming, thinking about what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and like, so to me, that's acting like it's true.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if it's true.
Yeah.
Right. So like, to me, that's the same thing. Like, if there's a belief, like I was thinking about like what I resist in a purely naturalistic worldview that doesn't include, let's say, like, I kind of like to talk to trees.
Yeah.
Right. I kind of think they're cool. And so the thought that they have this deep, slow sentience, I think of it like the Ents in Lord of the Rings. Like, they just move really slow so we don't notice.
Yeah.
Like, but
yeah.
and then looking at, okay, like, how do, like, when we clear cut something, the first things that comes up are the brambles, as if to say, back off, humans. We're trying to protect this area.
Yeah.
And so those, like, stories like that. And I say, well, if I act as if that's true, and if I want people to act as if these trees are sentinels, as if the mycorrhizae in the soil is acting like this really intelligent internet switchboard for consciousness. If those brambles are not just there to tear my clothes and to make me bleed, but they're actually a protective mechanism. Like,
yeah.
I don't know how you would prove that or not.
Yeah.
But I like it, and I act better when I'm a better person when I take on that story.
Yeah.
And
it's a frame of thinking that works for you in your context. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, like, if I had an argument against sort of this pure sentientism, I think it's hard for humans to not act based on a story.
Yeah.
And so if we have to, it's a question between a story or no story, or a story where I am, Adam, and I have control over the dominion over everything.
Yeah.
And everything is mine to do with as I please, versus sort of a more indigenous approach that there's consciousness, in everything. Like, I'll choose the second one.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. And I think there's plenty of space for finding stories in a naturalistic worldview, one just in the rich tapestry of reality. I mean, there's so many stories we can tell within that context. But I think having a naturalistic way of thinking doesn't preclude us from creating stories, believing fiction, or engaging in fiction, using those narrative frames to tell us things we want to do. So I don't think it precludes that, but I think you're right. It's a different approach. And I think the check I'd refer back to, and I guess where I do get a little bit hesitant, is humans are very good at coming up with narratives. They're powerful. They drive many of our motivations. And we're also very good at coming up with narratives that can be self-serving. And I guess the worry I have is that if our narratives are not grounded in reality, they become, to some degree, arbitrary. They could be anything. We could literally make up anything. And if you can make up anything, there are dangers in the ways those stories are told, or in those structures of belief, that can then warp compassionate ethics. They don't have to at all, right? They can be framed in a way that is compassionate and warm and rich and engaged with the world, but other people come up with arbitrary narratives and stories and webs of beliefs that are unfounded, and then they use them to warp ethics in self-serving ways. So that's my only concern about disconnecting from.
So I would say I have the same concern about people who simply take what they consider an evidence and reason approach.
Yeah.
Which is, when you look at the history of science over the last 100 years, using evidence and reason, we've destroyed the planet.
Yeah.
Right. It's just, like, I don't trust that human beings have the capacity to look at all the evidence or to interpret it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think, whatever it is, you have to, I mean, the two things that I will use as my checks, one is consistency.
Yeah.
So if I believe that trees are sentient and I believe that they dance, I've never seen that. They have roots. That seems unlikely to me, that they're actually like holding hands, holding limbs, and dancing when I'm not looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right now, sort of spiritually or metaphorically, like we know that trees talk to each other through chemical signals that scientists 20 years ago were being denied tenure for sharing that kind of information.
And now it's established scientific knowledge about as you say, the fungal networks and
right. And trees sacrificing themselves, parent trees sacrificing themselves for future generations, which we can all explain from an evolutionary biology perspective. And yet, so I want to say that there has to be consistency with the natural world. Like, I don't want to believe anything that my eyes are telling me isn't true. So that's one check.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
The second check is, I think, the second part of sentientism, which is compassion for all sentient beings. So if I believe that, the trees are trying to murder me, like one of these dark tales, like this is an evil forest, and someone's got to be on the lookout all night, or else the trees are going to stab you with their branches, and like that doesn't fit the worldview that I want to extend compassion to all. Like that's my check.
Yeah.
As opposed to is this realistic based on everything else, or is this consistent with everything else? And does it make me a good person based on the kind of person, my definition of a good person, which is a priori to the story.
Yeah, I like it. No, that sounds great. And I agree with your skepticism about, again, the sort of scientific way of thinking and the risks that can come along with that. Because what happens there is either those people who say we have a scientific worldview, we have all the answers, are actually wrong about the evidence, and they've had faulty reasoning, often both, right? Because they didn't have all the evidence and they didn't reason correctly. And hopefully now we can look back on some of those supposedly scientific mistakes and error correct and improve. But they also failed your second check, which we'll come on to next, which is compassion and moral consideration. They either constrained or made their compassion conditional, or didn't have it for certain outgroups at all, and that can lead us to terrible places. And in a way, that's almost self-servingly, I think that whenever we look back at almost any human-caused problem, the root of it tends to be either a failure of compassion. There was some group we excluded from our tribe or from our consideration, or we got something wrong about reality, just misunderstood reality. And that's why I think it's quite useful to have both a sort of an epistemology and compassion, sort of two base stances. But the second question, what matters, you've talked about already. You've talked about compassion. You've talked about not liking the sort of out-group tribalism. So I guess there's the first question in this what matters section is really, what is the grounding of your ethics and your morality? If it has a grounding, how do you think about what good and bad are? And the second question is that one about in-out groups and tribalism, and how do you draw the boundary of your moral consideration? And again, you can tell us a story, if you like, about where you started as a child and where you are now in terms of, who matters in your ethical thinking today.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as a child, I was taught a very pretty, on the one hand, a pretty conventional morality.
Yeah.
Like be nice to people. On the other hand,
sort of golden rule and
yeah. On the other hand, I got some very interesting sort of extreme lessons. So I had stories about, my mother at the age of 13 going to school one day after the Anschluss, after the German invasion of Austria, as it was termed, which she always believed it was an invitation as opposed to an invasion. And she goes to school and she's not allowed in school. And all the teachers and all her so-called friends are wearing Nazi armbands. And, and then the story so much like she got into, somebody called her a dirty Jew and she punched them. Like she was a competitive swimmer. And one of the things she did as part of her training was boxing. And she slugged the person in the face. And that was presented to me as like the right thing to do, like punch a Nazi.
Yeah.
Right. My father was a labor organizer. So we had, all these stories about, the fighting for the little guy.
Yeah.
like that was the central theme of the morality of my childhood, is that we have to protect the weak against the bullies.
Yeah, resisting oppression, standing up for the powerless, or
right. And at the same time, there were clear limits to that. So one of the stories that he told that I thought was just wonderful and hilarious for a long time was, he'd be defending a picket line of striking workers, and the owners are always the ones who are connected to the government and the police and the authorities. So they'd have police on horseback coming and trying to break up the picket line. And my father told this story about how he had like a old Swiss Army knife, and he had the little corkscrew out, and he stabbed the horse, and the horse bucked and the guy fell off, and like that was heroism. And I thought, like, what a great story, until I started considering like the sentience of the horse.
Yeah.
Like, oh boy, like, I don't know. Like that, it got more complicated for me.
Yeah, it's a big switch, isn't it? You go from thinking of that horse as an instrument, as an object, as a tool of oppression, and then something switches, and you think, hold on, they're a moral patient in their own right.
Yeah, and and then like who do we get to hate?
Yeah,
like I was very much brought up on an us against them, and luckily I was on the right side.
Yeah.
And then I grew older, and I realized that everybody thinks that way.
Everyone thinks they're on the right side, in the right tribe. Yeah, that's the problem.
Right. Yeah, right. It's like I don't know if Mitchell and Webb.
Yeah,
they have their the skit about, are we the baddies?
Yeah, right? Yeah, it's brilliant.
Like these Nazis, like well, gee, we have a skull and crossbones on our helmet. Maybe we're the baddies here.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this idea, like, just because everybody in my echo chamber is agreeing with me.
And so you talked about two shifts there. One is thinking, I guess shifting from thinking about, my tribe of humans to, I'm assuming, all humans, and just sort of erasing that boundary and saying we're all humans, we all matter, we should all get compassion, moral consideration. And then there's that other shift, which is, for most people on the planet, even more radical, which is recognizing that it's not just humans either. Non-humans, sentient non-humans matter in their own right too. And I'd be really interested to know on both fronts how that journey played out. Was it difficult in your family? Was it socially difficult? Was it intellectually a struggle, or did it feel like a sort of natural thing that you just switched on both of those stories? How did those processes work?
Yeah, so I'll be really honest that I'm still a humanist in my heart.
Yeah.
Like I am a sentientist in my mind.
Yeah.
Like I like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I do. Yeah.
Like it's almost like
we are humans. It's hard to, you can't bypass that in a sense, right? So it's sort of understandable. We would feel a natural affinity with our species. And I'm not necessarily sure. I mean, some would say we actively have to deny that to care about all the sentience. I'm not sure we do. I think many people can still feel a rich affinity for, all humans, and still have deep compassion for all sentient beings as well. In the same way as, I care about my family more than I care about other humans, right? I mean, I think it's understandable we'd prioritize or have different levels or different ways of caring. I guess my prime focus is the baseline, right? Making sure we don't exclude any suffering.
Right.
But, yeah. So
right.
You're a humanist in your heart, but maybe a sentientist in your mental attribution of moral consideration.
Yeah, and in my aspirations.
Yeah.
But like push comes to shove, like I'm not personally, like I know, I'm in the vegan community. I know a lot of people, including like my daughter, who suffer emotionally when they think about animal suffering.
Yeah.
And I don't. Yeah. Like, and I could like, I could wish that I did, or I could tell myself a story about like how I'm morally flawed, and I don't know what good or bad that would do. But what's important to me is how I act.
Yeah.
Right. So like, yeah, I don't really feel bad for chickens.
That's really interesting.
in my heart.
Yeah, because many people, I think you can come to this moral consideration and even compassion in different ways. It doesn't have to be. For many people, it is an emotional, empathic response. They can imagine what it's like to be a pig or a chicken or a dog or another human, and there is a emotional sense of connection there that drives the motivation. But I think it can also be intellectual and technical. You can say, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure they don't like suffering. I don't necessarily feel or empathize with that suffering, but I'm sure they do, and that is a bad thing in my moral system. And so intellectually, you can get to the same place. And I'd agree. It's ultimately the action. We as moral agents are interesting, but what really matters is the impact on the moral patients. The people and the sentient beings at the other end.
Yeah, because I can see how easily I am manipulated in my emotions for who I care about.
Yeah.
Whether it's a documentary and they play certain music, and all of a sudden now I'm caring.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or like I'll go to visit Farm Sanctuary and I'll see these, this pig the size of a couch, and they'll tell the story about the pig and how it escaped and its courage. And I'm like, oh, like I'm never going to eat a pig again. And then 2 months later, I'm vegan, so I'm not going to eat the pig, but I don't have the same. Yeah. Like I've lost, like I've come to terms with, okay, so that's where I am right now. Maybe it's even like more admirable that I don't eat animals, given that I don't have any particular moral qualms about it.
Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, the force of your intellectual thought and your logic and your consistency has driven you to a conclusion that some other people need that emotional drive. So yeah, maybe it's more admirable. And so, how did that transition happen if there wasn't this empathic connection? Because probably for most of my guests, it has been that classic path of, they grew up as a child having an emotional connection with animals, whether it was companions or others, but growing up in a set of social norms that just told them it was completely normal to consume them. And then at some point, making that connection, but partly because of that emotional connection and that sense of empathy, then however haltingly, my journey took ages, changing their lifestyle to try and reduce the harm and death they cause, hence veganism. So what was your journry like if you didn't have that sort of emotional drive?
Yeah, I think it was all for health reasons.
Yeah.
Then it was for environmental reasons. Yeah. Right. The first trigger was really John Robbins' Diet for a New America, which came out in 1987 and I read in 1990. And, I get very easily influenced by people that I imprint upon as wise elders, as moral leaders, which is dangerous because there's lots of people who think who are just really good people who could have very wrong ideas.
Yeah.
and I'm still imprinting upon them because I really like them. So, but that was the first one. And then, being part of I would say it's being part of the community.
Yeah.
That I was actually much more just sort of peer pressure. Like, oh, this is who I'm with. This is my tribe. This is what I do now. And it was, it was as simple as that. That I've been reading about Gregory Bateson's idea of schismogenesis. This idea that when you get two humans together, they agree on almost everything, and within an hour, they are bitter enemies over the one thing they disagree about.
Yeah.
And I think for me, okay, this is my tribe. I'm vegan now. The world hates me for it. Yeah. They're giving me all sorts of grief. And I'm going to buy the whole thing.
Do you think there's a risk you'll give it up now that veganism is becoming cool and avant-garde and is clearly the leading edge cultural development?
Well, so one of the
you're not going to be countercultural anymore. You're going to be the mainstream.
I know. I had that problem because I was a school teacher and I taught at a very conventional school, and I was the radical. I wasn't a very good teacher. There were a lot of things but I saw myself as the rule breaker, and the kids call me by my first name, and we're going to get real here, and we're not going to be grade grubbing. We're here for learning. And then I went to a Quaker school that was very countercultural. It was everything that I believed, and I really struggled. I didn't know how to not be the bad boy.
Yeah, I feel too normal here. What's going on? Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. No, so I would say from honestly, like I feel like I'm an instrumental vegan.
Yeah.
Like I read about sort of Native American or Aboriginal, Indigenous Australian hunting culture and honoring the animals, and I'm like, I would eat meat.
Mm.
Like I would eat animals under certain circumstances, and it just has to reach this standard for me. And so I look around and I go, I don't see anything in the world that is anywhere close to that standard.
Yeah.
So in this life, I'm a vegan, but it's not like I believe, there's forms of hunting that I would approve of. You know, it's almost like we're in a world where, we're trying to play basketball on an ice hockey court. Like
Yeah.
you can't do it right.
Yeah.
And so it's that,
And and I think that's an interesting difference in perspective, I think, between yours and mine, in that I think we'd absolutely agree that it can't be done right in the current world. And you look at, the way animal agriculture and fishing works today, and it's just shocking in so many contexts, unjustifiable. I think when I think about indigenous practices and hunting, I guess I have two perspectives on it, but they are both grounded in according moral consideration to the perspective of the victim in the situation. So what that leads me to is overall recognizing that these practices are a tiny, vanishingly tiny proportion of all the non-human farmed animal suffering that's going on today. But they are still meaningful to me from the perspective of the victim. And I can absolutely appreciate that if you're in a situation as a human community where, you have a survival imperative and, you don't have alternatives, many, many things might become justifiable that otherwise wouldn't be if you had viable alternatives. But at the same time, it doesn't erase the harm that's done to the individual animal. So I don't subscribe to this sort of romantic view that as long as we have reverence for the animal, or we're doing it in line with indigenous, supposedly sustainable practices, I can see why that might change the justification. But from the perspective of the animal concerned, doesn't help at all. So maybe there's a shift of emphasis there, because I do still come back to centering, whatever the situation is, I'm trying to think, right, which are the sentient beings in this situation? What is their perspective? And we have to take account of that. It doesn't mean that sometimes, causing harm and death might be justifiable. It might even be the right thing to do, even within humans, right? But I guess that's the essence for me, is not ignoring the perspective of any of the sentient beings involved in the process. But so again, I think we have a substantial overlap, and then maybe around the edges we can have some schismogenesis and fight over it.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the sort of wolves and caribou, where the two communities enhance each other. So I'm thinking about not just the individual, but the species as well. So one of my best friends grew up a hunter in Louisiana, and so I didn't know anything about hunting. I just had my suburban New Jersey, like I saw Deliverance,
Yeah.
But he's telling me, like,
knowledge,
like what hunting is like for these communities where people are going to put hundreds of pounds of meat in the freezer to live on, and I don't want any part of it, right? So you go get you get your corn, you set up the bait station, you sit there in your truck, which is burning fossil fuels, with an air conditioner, with your cooler of whiskey and beer. When you see the animal, you lower your window quietly, you take your high-powered rifle, you sit there, you shoot it in the ass, then you go and you sort of, walk over, like you've expended no calories.
Yeah.
Right. And it was an unfair fight. And the best you can say is good hunters will cull the old and the weak the way wolves would.
Yeah.
So it's like we're so far away from anything that looks like hunting that enhances, like I would say, like I give moral consideration to the individual the victims, as you put it.
Yeah.
But I also look at, like, one of the elements of my philosophy is this enhancing the diversity around us?
Yeah.
Right. Like any organism that has survived to this point only does so because they make the world a better place. They're generous. They're giving.
Yeah.
Trees give leaves and litter. Animals die, give their bodies to the soil. Like, humans are the only creatures who are like a net negative, and that's not sustainable. So I think if the way we get our food contributes to the growth and the flourishing of the diversity around us, then I'm more okay with it.
Yeah, understand. Yeah. And it feels like your moral scope goes beyond sentience in that sense, and that there's almost a spectrum you could choose. There's anthropocentrism, centered on humans. There's sentiocentrism, sentience matters. Then you could go beyond that to biocentrism, all living things matter, so all plants, for example, and even to ecocentrism, or a sort of holistic view, which says, look, I care directly about the ecosystem as a whole, species, habitats, rocks, rivers, the earth as Gaia. And it feels like your moral consideration goes broader than sentient in that context.
I think that's right. I think I come there through meditation.
Yeah.
Which, one of the principles of meditation is that my identification with myself is limited. It's like a drop of water popping out of the ocean for a second on the crest of a wave and saying, "Hey, look at me," as opposed to like, "Hey, I'm part of this ocean."
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree, and I share that perspective again. If maybe from even just a hard-edged naturalistic point of view, I think you and I are really just patterns of matter and energy and information processing that ultimately came from stardust out of the back of a supernova and will return there eventually as well. And I think so. You can still get to that sort of humble perspective that we are just a part of a system. But I think one of my hesitations, because I think there's a strong overlap, because I'm quite a strict sentientist, but I also care about ecosystems and the planet and biodiversity and so on. But I care about those other things because of their impact on sentient beings, not in their own right. So that's a difference. So I think we both care about all those things, but for slightly different reasons. Mine actually are more instrumental when you go beyond sentience. Mm-hmm. And I guess there's two things I'd ask of someone who goes beyond that. One is to say, okay, if we are going to care about all living things and even rocks and rivers and trees and species and so on, those things that can't actually experience suffering in their own right, surely we still have to give some degree of privilege to beings that we think can experience suffering. So even if we do grant moral consideration more broadly, I'd still say there's something that makes sentience a bit more special. And some people might agree with that, others might not. And part of the reason I ask for that, I don't always get it, is because it feels to me, as an example, like the modern environmentalist movement pretends to adopt that really broad, sort of systemic, holistic, ecocentric view. They're interested in the earth as Gaia. They're interested in ecosystems and species and biodiversity, and nature as this sort of romantic view of something that is intrinsically good. But then they will tell you a story sometimes which says, and we as humans need to be humble. We need to play our part in these systems. As part of these systems, like the wolf eats the caribou, life consumes life, I will consume from industrial factory farming. And it's like, hold on, you don't use a predatory wild animal as your guide to what's moral, and don't say you have a very broad moral scope that includes almost everything, while excluding vast tranches of very obviously sentient beings that actually do suffer from your moral consideration. So that's part of my worry about going beyond sentience, is there's a risk you almost flatten everything to the point where individual sentient beings can be disregarded or chewed up by the system for the sake of the system. Because in a sense, I think, I do care about species and biodiversity, but species can't suffer, whereas an individual deer or pig or chicken or human absolutely does. And that's the moral essence for me.
Right. Well, I wouldn't feed my family to my chickens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. As much, my chickens are starving. There's definitely there's definitely prioritization. What I would say,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
What I would say is instrumentalism the way you describe it, as everything that doesn't, fall into my boundary of sentientism is still important, but for the sake of the sentient,
Yeah.
is I think that, like, you and I can have this conversation, but I don't think that many people are going to.
Yeah.
And so what's important to me is that my immediate self-interest has to exist in a world in which it can contribute to all these other cascading layers.
Yeah.
So if I'm in a hunter-gatherer civil society and my immediate self-interest is just taking care of my gene pool, I'm going to behave towards my environment in a way that's going to enhance the trees and the wildebeests and whatever else.
Yeah. Just
because that's how the game is set up, right? It's set up in terms of a commonwealth, right? And we were talking about this later. This idea of, like, how would I make the world better? I think it's a huge problem if you and I have to some extent, deny our self-interest in order to be good people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, like, I want your instrumentalism or your selfishness about sentient beings has to help everybody, or else it's as my friend Tyson Yunkaporta, who wrote this amazing book called Sand Talk about how indigenous thinking can save the world, says Western civilization is a self-terminating algorithm. Right. So unless we can create a world in which me following my self-interest, like any animal, like any plant, like us, if we follow our self-interest and we make the world worse, then we are in the wrong system.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that perspective. And I think what I want to be clear that I guess what I'm suggesting with sentientism isn't insisting on total egalitarianism for all sentient beings. It's not suggesting the chicken and your own child have to have the same moral worth. There might be some people out there who think that, but I'm not suggesting an aggressive egalitarianism, and I'm also not suggesting that it means we drop our own self-interest and we act purely for the benefit of the quadrillion sentient beings that are on the planet. I don't think it's feasible, and I don't think it makes sense, and I don't think we could achieve it. But I guess what I'm suggesting by this moral considerability thing is really just setting a baseline to say we should at least consider morally each of those sentient beings. It doesn't mean we have to consider them equally. It doesn't mean we have to prioritize them over our own well-being and that of our family. But it just means we can't exclude them from our moral consideration. We have to take their perspective into account. And I guess at the very least, you could say that means we need to act for the benefit of all of them. Again, that's probably unrealistic. But at the very least, I think it should mean that we shouldn't needlessly cause them harm or death where we have viable alternatives, as a sort of act of commission baseline that says, look, at least they're in the outer ring of the tribe to the extent that we would see needlessly harming or killing them as a morally negative thing to do. So it's almost trying to set a really broad baseline rather than telling us how to prioritize within that, because we need to prioritize within that.
Yeah, and I think that it's disingenuous to use going beyond sentientism to undermine sentientism.
Yes, yeah, I think that I agree, right? And that's partly my concern with some of the modern environmental movement, is that if you're going out in these circles, you can't delete some of the inner circles, right? You have to broaden and extend, not say, I now care about biodiversity, but I don't care about the pigs in the factory farm.
Right, and I think a lot of that comes from marketing considerations, frankly. Yeah. Like, maybe we should tigers and elephants are more interesting than, shrews and moles.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then you hit that already, but we should come on to this final question of how do we make the world a better place? So you've already touched on some of the themes that you might want to come back to here around, I guess, capitalism, the sort of Western cultural systems most of us in my audience are plugged into, marketing, community, the importance of personal change. But again, you can sort of talk about a grand utopian vision, or you can talk more pragmatically about the levers we can pull to try and make things better in the context of your worldview. So you can start wherever you like.
I'd rather talk about the levers, because I don't feel like I am imaginative enough, and we don't have enough building blocks to think. Like, anything I would say that would be sort of utopian is based on flawed models. Like, I don't think we don't have the models we need yet. So I'll just talk about like what I try to do day to day.
I think it's good to be specific about the problems we're trying to fix, but I think it can be unhealthy to be too specific about the utopia for those reasons, right? We might just not have the right models, and maybe we need to let things evolve more openly, be open-minded about the utopias, but quite specific about the problems.
Yeah, and I think you can see pretty clearly some systemic issues that are going to stop us from being able to have the conversations. Like to get to utopia or to get to sustainability, we're going to need a lot of experiments, right? And we don't know how those experiments are going to run. So so in order to do that, we need to have a civilization in which it's okay to experiment. It's okay to have made a mistake. It's okay to admit that this didn't work. And, when I look at where that should be, like I think of like pure science, and I find it almost nowhere in pure science. People saying, oh, I tried this and I was wrong, or I devoted my career to this and it turned out to be a dead end. Or, gee, someone published a paper that totally debunked what I had been saying, and I'm so happy.
Yeah. Yeah, the human psychology runs through science as much as it does, anywhere else.
Right. So what I'm working to do is to kind of in very micro environments to create places where people can support each other rather than shame each other.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and that starts with being okay with ourselves. Like if I'm, I think like one of my intellectual mentors is a guy named Stephen Porges, who wrote a book 10 years ago called The Polyvagal Theory. And it's a lot of anatomy and science and biology that I don't understand, but the basic thing I took away from it is, in order for human beings to be effective and good and happy, we have to feel safe.
Yeah.
And we live in a world that is designed to make us unsafe, to make us feel unsafe. And so if you imagine a species constantly in fight or flight, like if you look at Discovery Channel or National Geographic, and you see the wildebeests all hanging out, or the springbuck, and then the animal comes and they're all in fight or flight, they all run away, and then afterwards they shake a bit, and then there's no more danger, then they relax again, and they can nurture each other and they can pay attention. But if we're in constant fight or flight, which is kind of the basic, like there's a basic level of trauma that culture gives us, regardless of if you had a so-called happy childhood or not, or if your parents cared for you when you cried or beat you or somebody abused you, or you were in war or car accident. Even if everything went, quote, right, we are not nurtured in the way that human beings are meant to be nurtured based on what we know about our nervous system, our physiology. And so I think for me, the main job is helping people reverse that so that we can have nodes of people who can co-regulate others. That you have a very calm voice, very calm presence. There are areas you're an intellectual, and there's areas in which we may disagree. And I have never felt you to be disagreeable. I've never felt you to be anything other than supportive of me expressing my ideas, curious about them. And that's not how these conversations always go.
Yeah.
But you're confident enough in yourself that you have the ability to help me regulate my own emotions. I don't think I became defensive. I don't think I became argumentative, but I could.
Yeah. Wait till I ask my next question.
Yeah, right. Those aren't outside my repertoire.
Yeah.
Right. But if we're both doing work on ourselves, we can co-regulate. We can say like, okay, like we live in a culture that is so polarized and divided that our knee jerk is to shame others. And the other thing I got from Tyson Yunkaporta is like the original sin is narcissism, which he translates as I am better than you, I am greater than you, you are lesser than me.
Yeah.
And he applies it as an indigenous Australian to everything, to other, animals, rocks, wind, right? And to me, like, that's not a bad way to go about it. but when I'm threatened by someone, like I had a discussion with someone the other day about ivermectin, and they're taking ivermectin and they're very happy to be taking ivermectin. And I had to do a hell of a lot of self-work to honor their concerns, to honor, and when they want the same things I do. They want to be safe, they want their family to be well, they want to be healed, they want to take care of the people around them, right? So for me to shame them and say, don't you know how stupid you are? What kind of sheep are you? Right. Like that all came up.
Do you really have a worm infestation?
And yet I went and then started doing research on the science of ivermectin. And I read an article in the Atlantic by this forensic scientist who does like extensive review of peer-reviewed articles. And he said, like, there's 30 articles on ivermectin. He looked at 5 that were complete garbage. It's like, we don't actually know anything. We don't know if it was, like, the science is so bad. So, for me to be able to hold my tongue and to extend compassion and to be curious and to talk to the other person, like, I think, there's some little degree of healing. And like, that's what I'm trying to bring into the world.
And have you arrived at that philosophy of, I guess, personal change and engagement because it's the right thing to do, or because it's effective, or a bit of both?
Yeah, well, I mean,
because I think my suspicion is it is both, right? It's also it's a impactful way of, per your recent book, of actually affecting change with other people. It is effective because you can engage with them, you can find common ground, just showing respect. You're not kicking off the fight or flight, but it also feels just more basically a more moral way to engage with someone if we have compassion for them. Even compassion for people we disagree with or have fights with on Twitter.
Right. Yeah, well, you had a beautiful conversation a couple of weeks ago on your podcast about, like, should we kill Hitler?
Yeah.
And yes, but should we be angry about it? No. Do it like the surgeon doesn't get mad at the tumor.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, like, if I could make everybody believe the way I believe and act the way they should, would I do it? Yeah. Okay. Like, if I had all the guns and all the armies, would I change things? Hell yeah. So great. Do I? No.
Benign dictator.
Who has the money? Who has the weapons? Who has the might? Who has the armies? Who controls the people with the bulldozers in the Amazon?
Yeah.
Not me. So then what do I have left? I have persuasion. So am I going to, throw blood on their fur coats to convince them? Am I going to, at that point, it's totally utilitarian. Like, what do I think has a chance of working here? Is it shaming them? And, there's people who argue, like PETA would say that, that shaming can work. It can change public opinion. And so, if there is a large third body of people whose minds could be swayed, but I would say let's look at, like, the civil rights movement in the United States. The shame occurred when the protesters on the bridge got hosed, and everybody could see, oh, look who's acting like animals. It's not the people we thought were animals; it's the people we thought were us.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I believe, like, I don't believe that shame is a terrible thing, but I think when we try to induce it in others, it doesn't work. I think if we can, and people, you feel shame, and hopefully you go immediately to remorse, because shame just shuts you down.
Yeah.
But like that moment of shame,
or even pushes you into denial.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the book that I just wrote. It's got a provocative title. You can change other people.
Yeah.
But the methodology is behind it is shift from a critic to an ally. Look at, as we were talking earlier, like, what does they want? What's their positive intent? What are they trying to do? And how can we find a shared positive intent that we can work with together? And then I can, if I'm talking with them, people can then often easily drop old opinions if they don't feel pressured or pushed or shamed or criticized or argued with. And I'm not good at debating. I liked it, but I used to lose because I wasn't very good at it. And I just, and just in terms of there is some level of moral guidance that I give myself based on what feels good. Like, does this feel like me winning an argument almost never feels good?
Yeah.
But me talking to someone I disagree with and saying, tell me how you think about this, right? Talking to anti-vaxxers and saying, like, tell me really what's going on for you, what matters to you.
Yeah.
Like, it may or may not change their view, but they'll have another conversation with me.
Yeah. Be open about their fears, their worries. Yeah.
Yeah. And it turns out we have exactly the same worries. Both of us want to avoid having something enter our body that's going to harm us.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. For one of you, it's a virus. For the other one, it's the vaccine. So
I mean, it's more schismogenesis.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we can talk about, so what are you hearing? What am I hearing? I wonder, and then we can get to, like, people can be rational when they are not in fight or flight.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a deep insight. Yeah. And final question before I let you go. A lot of your work is about that personal change and personal engagement and using the power of persuasion, but just high integrity engagement with people. How do you think that links through to institutional level and systemic challenges? Do you think that the personal is the right way to influence the institutions, or do you think they're almost like parallel sets of levers we need to pull? And I guess as part of that, you talked about capitalist systems earlier on. Do you think we need a completely different system, something totally radically different, or can we, through personal change, drive a stronger morality through the systems we have today? Again, crazily big questions. Sorry.
Yeah. The answer is I have no clue.
Yeah.
And I have certain impulses came up, like things I suspect. I think that people are not naturally bad. I think any system that creates this kind of scarcity, and the kind of, the need for a whole bunch of people to feel like they have no choice but to obey another bunch of people, like, doesn't feel like a good system.
Yeah.
So I think there are levers that I don't understand. There are levers of change that I'm not good at, so I would never say they aren't useful. From my perspective, like, when I look at history, and that we talked a little bit on the last talk about, Harari, his idea, like, the story is the most powerful thing. Like, that's like my main concern with sentientism, is that it's not a compelling enough story for most people.
Yeah.
But that we need that there are stories about my place in the universe that make me feel good and important and strong, that in which I don't have to exert cruel dominion over everything else. And I think those are the stories that we need to start telling. So it's not just, hey, I'm going to help these people at this company become better at making money. Like, I just looked at a study, some recruiting firm did a study, a huge survey of which are the happiest companies in America. And like, number one was NVIDIA, and then Adobe, Google, Facebook. Like, that's wonderful. They have these cultures where people feel nurtured by and large, and they feel supported and taken care of, and they have good work-life balance, and they're doing passionate, meaningful work. That's great, but they're still fucking destroying the world. And they're, so I think we can't just stop with good people treating each other well within a system that makes that a privileged position.
Yeah, thank you. And I totally agree with you that this idea of sentientism as a basic worldview is just not sufficient. It's a platform, it's a starting point, it's a grounding, if you like, but it's not sufficient. We need to build stories and narratives and ideas and programs of change, on top of that, in enormous sort of plurality and richness. I totally agree. It's not sufficient in its own right. You need that, series of narratives and stories to hook people and motivate people and, to feel meaning on top of that platform. So, yeah. And I also don't, have a strong view about what the answers are to many of the institutional challenges we've got, whether it's in terms of corporations or NGOs or governments or local governments, and all of those complex networks, because there's obviously so much power invested in those. But I guess I do reassure myself that all of those systems ultimately are made up of individual people that we can engage with compassion and integrity. And as people like you influence those people positively, that also changes the institutions those people are part of and stakeholders in too. So
yeah, it's like that traffic game where you have or that puzzle with all the tiles and squares.
Yeah,
and you can sort of like move the car from, like, if there's no empty square, then nothing happens.
Yeah.
Like we need to be able to loosen people up to be willing to be creative and to be willing to put things, to risk crazy ideas, new ways of being. And it may or may not get us there, but if people are scared, then we're definitely not going to make it.
Yeah. And back to your, I guess, the humanism at your heart, I think you're right that the vast majority of the 7.8 billion people on this planet spend most of their time in some sort of flight or fight mode, struggling with the bottom half of Maslow's hierarchy. And I guess a hopeful message maybe to end on is just imagine the potential of the human species if we can free more of those 7.8 billion people, from those struggles and from that flight or fight mentality, and we could really open up and see what we could do.
Yeah, there's really interesting work on sort of change around systems. And so there's a book called Change by a data scientist, Damon Centola, who says, like, there's the tipping point is far lower than we think it is.
Yeah.
Like we don't need a majority.
Yeah, you don't need 51%. Yeah, I agree. There's hope there. There's hope there. And I think you talked again about taking lessons from previous social change movements. When you're in them, driving them, they always feel too slow. When you're resisting them, they always feel too fast. But when you look back on them, it's amazing how quickly some of them turned around, right? And because, as you say, you didn't need 51%. You had 5, 10, 15%, whatever it was. There was a much earlier tipping point that could drive radical change really quickly. And we certainly need it.
Amen.
Yeah.
Can I say amen to a sentientist?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I take it in the spirit of which it was meant. Yeah.
It's from a Hebrew word meaning truth.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a good route to go back to. Yeah. Well, Howie, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for letting me turn the tables. And inspiration and a real pleasure.
What an honor. When I look at the other people you've interviewed, there's a part of me going, what the hell am I doing here?
Not at all. You're part of the pantheon. They'll be saying the same thing when they see your name appear on the list. So. It's been a genuine pleasure. So what's the best way of people following you, buying your book, learning more about your work? I can include links in the show notes, of course, but where would you point people?
So buy the book from your local independent bookstore, if you can. It's called You Can Change Other People. It's by me and Peter Bregman. If you have to get it online, just how to do that.
Yeah.
I have a podcast called Plant Yourself, which is probably, very sort of sentientist aligned and friendly. I talk about individual, communal, and planetary health with a plant-based focus. I have my business site is one page just for people who want to, talk about, coaching that pays me money, is askhowie.com.
Great. And I think you're out Ask Howie on Twitter as well, aren't you? So.
I am. And I check Twitter at least once every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
If you DM me, I will get to it eventually.
Eventually. That's great. Well, thank you again, Howie. It's been a real pleasure, and stay in touch.
Thank you, Jamie. It's been really fun.
Take care.